Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today on improving gender balance and equalities. I'm Evelyn Wilkins and I work in the communications team at the General Teaching Council for Scotland. And I am joined by Dr. Heather Earnshaw, Education Officer at Improving Gender Balance Scotland, Education Scotland, and Dr. Sarah McGeown, Senior Lecturer in Developmental Psychology at Edinburgh University. It's lovely to be with you this afternoon. In the webinar today, Heather and Sarah hope to engage in discussion about how gender stereotypes can have a negative impact on both boys and girls, and how early years professionals and teachers can actively challenge gender stereotypes in their classrooms. The webinar is being broadcast live and will be recorded and posted on our website afterwards. All webinar participants are muted and we cannot see or hear you. Hopefully the technology will not let us down today, but please bear with us if we do experience any technical difficulties. If you do have any problems with vision or sound, please consider that it may have something to do with your own broadband connection, but please do let us know so that we can see if there are any problems that we need to be aware of. Please do feel free to send in questions throughout the webinar, and Sarah and Heather will answer as many as they can in a discussion session at the end of the webinar. If we receive a number of questions on the same point or theme, we may respond in one overarching answer rather than individually. We hope you enjoy the webinar and would really appreciate it if you could provide us with feedback afterwards. You can do this by completing the online survey, which will launch once the webinar is finished, or by emailing us at communications@gtcs.org.uk. I'd now like to pass you over to Sarah and Heather, who are going to begin the webinar now. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think now you should all be seeing my screen. So I'm Heather Earnshaw. Thank you. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for signing in. Sarah and I wanted to start by asking two questions. So let's see if I can get this to work. I should be able to launch a question on your screens. Just looking at how confident you feel about recognizing gender stereotypes. And I've got some responses. And I'll leave it another couple of minutes while everybody else has a chance to vote. Thank you. And then I'm going to close that, and I think I can share the results with everybody. And then, without spending too much time on that, I'd like to ask a second question, if that's okay, before we go on to the main presentation. So that's the second question, open. And again, I'm going to close it and quickly show the results. And then I'll hide that. So thank you. That's really helpful for Sarah and I. So I'm going to talk initially about the kind of background to the program, how it was established. And then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who'll talk about the research that underpins what we're doing. And then I'll talk again about, I suppose, in more detail about exactly what it is that we do through the program. So this is my Improving Gender Balance and Equalities in one slide. And our overarching aim is trying to improve gender balance in subject choice and learner pathways. And we're doing that by working with early years practitioners, primary and secondary school staff, around identifying ways to challenge gender stereotypes, to understand and address unconscious bias, and how to do that in a whole establishment, whole setting, or whole school approach. And why are we doing that? So this is just looking at STEM subjects, mainly because that's my background. I used to be a physics teacher. This graph is looking at SQA data for STEM hires over the last 30 years along the x-axis at the bottom. And for each graph, it's showing it's showing the percentage of entries for that subject that are male. So physics, which I used to teach, is the third line down, the blue line. And physics for the last 30 years has been fairly consistently about 70% boys and about 30% girls. And other subjects have different proportions. But for me, the key thing is that we know that subject uptake is gendered, but that how little change there's been in those graphs over the last 30 years, despite the fact that we know a lot of people are doing a lot of work to try and shift those patterns. The Institute of Physics, which is where the project started, had been doing a lot of work into what kinds of things might make a difference, specifically to increase the proportion of girls who take physics at A level. They were working in England at that point. And they find that the kinds of things that people still suggest to me might have an impact, things like having lots of role models, having talks around physics and what physics can do, introducing speakers into the school, those things can have a small effect, but it tends to be quite a small effect. And so if we want to have the larger scale change, then something else is needed too. And they continued looking into the problem and trialing different effects and decided that one of the things, one of the something else's, might be around social and cultural attitudes. And that was backed up by other pieces of research, for example, with Aspires at King's College in London. So Sarah will talk more about this in a minute, but this is just kind of a snapshot of what I mean by social cultural attitudes. These are word clouds generated by S1. These are girls. S1 girls, oops, I've gone into automatic mode. When asked about, if I go back, asked about jobs they associate with women and jobs they associate with men. Now, it is quite a leading question, but I think it's interesting that the two sets of words are quite different. So the words they associate with women are, sorry, if I go back to female jobs, nothing wrong, of course, with any of those jobs, but it is, I would argue, quite a narrow selection of jobs, mostly focused on appearance and caring professions, whereas girls perceive the boys as just having more jobs. There were just more words in that word cloud. And if we ask boys the same question, they give very similar responses. And so the Improving Gender Balance Scotland project was set up in 2015, and it was a partnership between the Institute of Physics, Education Scotland and Skills Development Scotland. And it was established to trial interventions with early years primary and secondary schools to co-develop and trial interventions to try and tackle that persistent gender imbalance in the interests that young people have, and then the subjects they choose later and the pathways they choose beyond that again. And I think I'm going to hand over to Sarah now. Sorry, I was thrown slightly by my slides moving on when I didn't expect them to. I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to talk about the research that underpinned the pilot project.
I hope everyone's got my first screen up and can view it now. So my name is Sarah McGeown. I'm a senior lecturer in developmental psychology based in Moray House School of Education and Sport, and I was involved in the recent literature review which was published by Improving Gender Balance and Equalities in Education Scotland. And today I'll be talking about what the research says with regards to gender differences, gender stereotypes, and how we can challenge or tackle these within the classroom. So I'll be taking a research-informed approach to understand the similarities among and differences between boys and girls. I'll be talking about gender stereotypes and unconscious bias, what we mean by these terms and the impact that they can have within the classroom. And finally, I'll talk about research-informed approaches to tackle gender stereotypes and evidence of their effectiveness as well. So the term gender differences is one that you'll probably all be very familiar with. A term that you may be less familiar with is gender similarities, which is quite ironic really, because gender similarities is a much more accurate term to reflect what we know about the attitudes, skills and abilities of children and young people. Now, meta-analyses have been carried out, and these are syntheses of large-scale research studies looking at sex differences in specific topics. And what these meta-analyses have shown is that in a number of studies, there's absolutely no evidence of sex differences. And then in about 78% of studies, the evidence of sex differences suggests trivial or very small differences between boys and girls in cognitive, psychological, and educational domains. This is also reflected within attainment data as well. So if we think about the large-scale international comparison studies of TIMSS, that's the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, This is a study which is carried out every 4 years or so. Typically 50, 60 countries participate, looking at the maths and science attainment of children and young people aged approximately 9 and 13. And in many of these countries, there's absolutely no evidence of sex differences in maths and science attainment. In some countries, there is evidence of sex differences, but sometimes these will be in boys' favour and sometimes in girls' favour. When we look at reading research, PEARLS is the comparative to TIMSS. So PEARLS, again, is a large-scale international comparison study looking at the reading attainment of children approximately age 9. And again, typically 40 or 50 countries participate. Now, what you do find when it comes to reading attainment is evidence of much more consistent sex differences, and these are in girls' favour. So the differences in attainment for reading are much more robust and much more consistent than the sex differences that you find for maths and science. Despite this, there's still considerable variation in the scores of boys and considerable variation in the scores of girls and considerable overlap as well. Now, Hyde and Lynn in 2006 argued that focusing on sex differences and socializing children according to their sex will restrict children and young people from realizing their potential. What we do know is, despite the fact that there are very narrow or almost no sex differences in skills and abilities, there are very strong sex differences when it comes to subject-specific choices, as Heather demonstrated within that graph, or when it comes to career outcomes or career aspirations. And I suppose the main take-home message that I'd like you to get from this is that the choices that children and young people are making are not a reflection or not an accurate reflection of their skills and their abilities. So what do we mean when we talk about gender stereotypes and unconscious bias? Well, gender stereotypes are basically stereotype beliefs that we have about what boys and girls can and should do. Okay, so they're descriptive. Okay, they describe what we think boys and girls can do, but they're also prescriptive as well, prescribing what we think boys and girls should be doing. And researchers often draw the distinction between explicit and implicit gender stereotypes. And when asked directly, teachers, children and young people will often deny explicit gender stereotypes. And yet when we test them implicitly, there is evidence that they're there. For example, they may be faster to associate the word boy with science and faster to associate the word girl with reading. And these implicit gender stereotypes that we hold are a result of the environment that we've been raised in. They're a result of our kind of social and cultural context. What do we mean by unconscious bias? This is basically automatic cognitive thought processes of learned stereotypes. They're spontaneous, they're unintentional, but our unconscious biases can have an impact on our languages and our behaviour. Now, gender stereotypes and unconscious bias can have an impact across all education settings, from the early years right the way through to primary, secondary and further education as well. And they can have a negative impact on teachers, on children and on young people. So it's really important that we critically reflect on the biases that we may have, the gender stereotypes that we hold, and how these influence our languages, our thoughts and our behaviours as well. As I've said, the biases that we have are as a result of the environment that we've been raised in, and we need to think about the messages that we want to send to the next generation of learners. So gender stereotypes and unconscious bias can have a negative impact on both boys and girls, and I think a lot of research and a lot of focus most recently has been looking on girls and the negative impact of gender stereotypes on girls, particularly in relation to STEM. But there's also a very strong negative impact of gender stereotypes on boys. Indeed, it's been argued that gender stereotyping is more restrictive for boys than it is for girls, that boys are bound by stricter rules of gender conformity than girls are, whereas girls are more likely to be encouraged to transcend gender boundaries. So, for example, girls are more likely to encourage to pursue activities or subject choices that have historically been more masculine orientated, but boys are less likely to be encouraged to transcend these gender boundaries. So there does seem to be something about gender stereotyping that makes it more restrictive at present for boys than for girls. Gender stereotypes and unconscious bias can have a negative impact on boys' academic engagement and their reading and writing as well. So with regards to academic engagement, Kessels et al. In 2014 made the point that male students experience a fundamental conflict between putting effort into their schoolwork or following rules at school and maintaining a cool and masculine image in front of their peers. In other words, boys' lower academic engagement is a result of their ability or their desire to demonstrate or verify their masculinity. In my own research, I've been looking at the negative impact of gender stereotypes on boys' reading and writing. What I've done is I've carried out research which has looked at these large-scale international comparison studies, and as I've said earlier, what you see is much more consistent and wider differences in the reading and writing skills of boys compared to girls when we look at maths and science, where there really isn't a strong evidence of gender differences. In my research, I've been looking at children's gender identity, that is, the extent to which they identify with traditional masculine and feminine traits. And what you find is that reading and writing are gendered. Children who identify with more feminine traits are more motivated to read and enjoy reading more than children who identify with more masculine traits. With regards to girls, gender stereotypes and unconscious bias have a negative impact on girls' science and maths. So, for example, there was an interesting study published last year by Miller and colleagues. This was a meta-analysis looking at 5 decades of draw scientist studies. And what they found is that over the last 5 decades, children's depictions of scientists have become more gender diverse over time, yet they're still more likely to draw male scientists. And this is particularly true for boys, although girls are beginning to draw more female scientists. When it comes to maths, we know that stereotype threat has a negative impact on girls' maths performance, even when they deny explicitly holding gender stereotypes. So there's clearly a lot of way to go in order to reduce the negative gender stereotypes associated with maths and science. Now, as part of the literature review, what we shared was evidence-based approaches in order to challenge gender stereotypes. And on reviewing the research, I would say the quality and quantity of research available is good, but I think there's definitely an opportunity to develop this. And I think that through the Improving Gender Balance and Equality programme, there's an opportunity for you to try out things within your classroom, to evaluate them and to share your learning with other colleagues. As teachers, you are important agents in combating gender stereotype ways of thinking and gender stereotyped education choices. And to date, I would say the research which has looked at ways to challenge gender stereotypes has broadly focused on 4 different areas. So the first is to raise awareness of implicit and explicit gender stereotypes among teachers and students. And I think that engaging in the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme and the resources that they offer is a really good way to kind of start that journey. Another approach is to make the learning environment as unbiased as possible and ensure that schools use materials that promote gender equality. So this means sort of removing textbooks or posters or resources which really ingrain these gender stereotype notions. So maybe introducing children to books where you have gender atypical characters or characters who are engaging in diverse activities. But one of the points that's been made from research is that these messages need to be given very clearly and very consistently, because what you sometimes find is that when children are asked to recall information from these books, often they will distort or misremember information to align it more with gender stereotypes that they're more familiar with. And this is because a lot of gender stereotypes are just deeply ingrained, even at quite a young age. Another approach which has been suggested is to provide children with opportunities to develop skills and success in gender stereotype domains. And this means ensuring children's early play experiences are very diverse and very broad. And there was also an interesting study carried out by Master et al. And published in 2017, in which they gave 6-year-old children the opportunity to practice programming robots. Prior to doing this, both boys and girls held the view that technology was more for boys and that boys were better at it. But after taking part in the activity, girls reported more interest and more confidence into the use of technology compared to girls who hadn't received the same intervention. And other approaches are about avoiding the use of gendered language within the classroom. And very often we use language which has gender cues within it. So, for example, fireman or air hostess. So what next? Well, early year settings in schools are social contexts context in which gender beliefs and behaviours are defined and constructed. In your setting, you can choose to reproduce the dominant gender ideologies that exist or persist in our society, or you can choose to challenge them. I think a whole school approach is always going to be optimal in order to have sort of clear and consistent messaging. But if this is something that you feel really passionate about doing and you don't feel your school's ready to start this journey, then maybe try introducing some activities within your own class and share your learning with other people. Finally, I'd just like to make a point which I think is quite important, and that is that there's nothing wrong with children and young people behaving in gendered ways. Okay, children and young people should be encouraged to behave in ways that reflect their personalities. What is problematic is when they start to believe that their choices and opportunities in life are restricted because of preconceived notions of gender. And I think this is what the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme is trying to tackle. What I'll do now is I'll pass back over to Heather now, who will talk a little bit more about the programme.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm really just going to build on what Sarah's talking about and say how those kind of 4 areas that she identified as being useful ones to act on in schools and nurseries, and how we've seen that play out through the pilot project and how we're taking it forward now. So I suppose the first one is, for me, is around challenging children and young people to recognise gender stereotypes and to recognise, as Sarah said, and I think I alluded to at the beginning, that there's a difference between their explicit opinions and thoughts and the implicit ones. So when I showed the word clouds of the jobs earlier, I'm pretty confident that if I'd asked those children if they thought there were jobs that men or women couldn't do, they would have been pretty adamant that no, of course not, that anybody can do everything. But when we dig a bit deeper, there were implicit assumptions about what kind of jobs were open to different kinds of people. And so what activities can we embed in our teaching, in our curriculum, in our interactions that help surface those opinions and help us have conversations with young people about where those opinions have come from, whether they are valid opinions, whether they apply to all girls, all boys. This is a very simple activity where this particular one was a P4 class, asked to write down words they associate with girls and words they associate with boys. And again, I don't for a minute think that everybody in that class would say that all girls fitted into the word cloud in the left and all boys into the one on the right, but there are very different kinds of words in the 2 word clouds. And so I think that's a good starting point for asking questions about, do all girls, do all boys fit into those categories? What if you're a child who doesn't fit into one of those? One of the big ones for the girls is kind. Can boys be kind? Are all girls kind? And when I first started working on this, I think I said at the beginning, I came from a physics teaching background, and I wasn't sure how this kind of conversation would play out this was, as I said, a P4 class. But I've watched teachers have just amazing conversations with young people who really want to discuss this kind of thing and the kinds of messages they're receiving. And there's so many different ways that we have gendered messages woven through our society, and so there's so many ways in which you can start to unearth the gendered thinking. These 2 activities were around jobs. So the one on the left was just simply a P3 class, I think, sorting jobs into were they for girls or for boys. And actually that class themselves, they'd done a bit of work with the teacher. It was the young people themselves who said, no, but actually we need a category in the middle for both. And the one on the right was that same class drawing people in a range of professions and then naming them and then again discussing who had. So I think all the scientists or almost all the scientists had male names, almost all the teachers had female names, and again we could have a conversation, or the teacher could have a conversation about who can do what kind of job, what skills are needed for what kind of job, and who has those kind of skills, and are those skills gendered, and no, they're probably not. So again, helping to unpick assumptions that young people have already absorbed. Through books, and again, Sarah made reference to this, but books, and at any age, I mean, from early years up to S5, S6, I've had teachers I've worked with using books to, again, either show alternatives to the standard stereotypes or using more traditional text to discuss the stereotypes. And I think also thinking about this, my feeling is that there are a lot of examples of books that are showing girls like Rosie Revere, engineer, showing STEM kind of activities, but we don't have so many, and again, Sarah alluded to this, we don't often talk so much about boys being kind or boys being caring, and so I like The Smartest Giant and Down, and good night, Mr. Tom, for that. And there are lots of other examples. I'm not for a second suggesting those are the only ones. So I think all of those, that strand for me is about equipping our young people to recognise the gendered messages, the gendered thinking that we're all of us constantly bombarded with. Toy marketing is another good example. And allowing them to challenge that thinking, to challenge their own thinking, to challenge each other, and actually also to then challenge the adults around them. And I think for that to have a long-term impact, then that needs to be planned for, and it needs to be consistent and sustained throughout a young person's experience through school. So I think a one-off lesson in P3 by itself probably isn't going to shift things, but if as a whole school or as a cluster, that's something that's revisited regularly, then I think it does begin to impact what people are thinking. And then I think the other bit of it for me is maybe specifically around the text, is one head teacher that we worked with in the pilot was recognising that her staff had been a bit awkward at first about having those conversations and about bringing stereotypes to the fore with the class. But the head teacher said, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so once her staff became more aware of how gender feeds into so many messages that we receive, all of us constantly, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And so they felt it became much more natural in their practice to kind of point things out and for it to become just part of the conversation that happens every day in the classroom. The second strand then I think is probably the trickiest, and that's the bit about us as the adults in the classroom having our own unconscious bias and being open to recognising that that affects how we interact with the young people in front of us in different ways. And everything I'm about to talk about, I absolutely did when I was a physics teacher. So I can think back on my practice and recognise patterns of behaviour that I didn't challenge at the time, expectations that I had that, again, I didn't necessarily think about. So, for example, we know that research suggests that whole class interactions tend to be dominated by boys, not all boys in any given class, but there tends to be a subgroup of more dominant boys who are more likely to offer answers, are more likely to offer to volunteer, are more likely to shout out. And that's probably not because we are selecting them more often because they're boys, but they've learned to dominate and they've learned to be more visible, and so we respond to that. And again, when I talk about that, I've got one particular S3 class that I can really think of. And so I think us as teachers, we need to be thinking about how do we support the less visible pupils to have a voice, but also actually how do we support those children who've learned to dominate, how do we support them in learning to be less dominant? And I think that has to go both ways. And I think some of that probably is around structural change about how we operate in classrooms. So I know I've worked with schools where they've implemented a no hands up policy, for example, and that allows a more, think pair share type strategy, show me boards, all those kinds of things that we would recognise as being nothing new or innovative, they're just good teaching, but allowing everybody to have a voice in the classroom. Something that, again, I hadn't particularly thought of until I got involved in this programme was how even subtler ways in which we interact with individuals can depend on the gender of the individual and other protected characteristics. But so, for example, the way we might scaffold questions, the kinds of feedback we might give. I don't want to talk too much about the research, but I think there are really subtle ways in which we interact with young people that takes quite a lot of openness and honesty in ourselves and working collegiately to recognise and then try and change. Sarah's mentioned language already, and I suppose the other thing I wanted to touch on was around expectations of people, but also what we attribute success and failure to. So research suggests that we're more likely to attribute success in boys in physics and maths, for example, to being about innate ability, so they're just really good at physics or maths. Whereas when girls attain well, we're more likely to attribute it to them just working hard. And conversely, if they don't do well with the girls, we're more likely to say, well, they're just not very good at physics, maths, whereas with the boys, we're more likely to say, well, they just were a bit lazy, they just didn't work very hard. And I've read that research, and it wasn't until very recently that I thought again, and I've been out of the classroom for almost 4 years now, looking back to young people and the kinds of conversations I have with them after tests, for example, I think I was probably more likely to say to boys who didn't do as well as they expected, well, did you do enough revision? Whereas to girls, I was probably more likely to say, did you understand the material? Are there things you need me to explain to you? And that's quite subtle, but I think that will then have a real impact on the children about whether they think, yeah, I just didn't work hard enough, but I'm quite good at it, or no, I didn't understand, I'm not very good at it. So I think this is probably the trickiest one. I think it's the one that takes most personal reflection and will take a long time to chip away at, I think, to change our practice in the classroom, because classrooms and early learning childcare settings are such busy places. My team is hoping to launch a kind of online blended learning module to support this reflection, to support tweaks to practice. So look out for that. That will hopefully come in the autumn. This, I think Sarah has already touched on, but it's about the kind of the structural things, looking at the environment. So if you look at just the classroom walls, the school walls, the feel of the school or the setting through a gendered lens, then are there posters that maybe could change? Are there subtle messages? So for example, one nursery I was visiting quite recently was saying that the name tags that are pre-prepared when children start at the nursery at the beginning of the year, traditionally, the girls' names had things like butterflies and flowers on them, whereas the boys tended to have, I can't actually remember what it was, but it was different. It was trucks and dinosaurs or something. And nobody had set out to do that deliberately, but that was something they were looking at changing. So it's a really subtle messaging that girls and boys like different things. Some of that, looking at the environment, of course, could be done through the eyes of young people, so people voices. Again, in early years, primary and secondary schools, I've worked with teachers who've been supporting pupil groups to look at the environment, the wider aspect of the environment, and instigate changes. The sound of the environment, what I was thinking there was around, again, it touches on the language that Sarah referenced, but also subtle things. So is sexist banter allowed? Do you hear references around, you know, you're such a girl, or man up, or again things like I need 2 strong boys to help me move that. So again, subtle things around language that any one event won't have an impact, but all those kind of constant microaggressions do build up to an impact. Just keeping an eye on the time here. And then the last one, again, Sarah referenced this, but I think it's about how do we make sure that we're building confidence and skills across the whole curriculum for all our young people, from early years, from nurseries through to secondary schools. So in early year settings, for example, and I have seen some fabulous settings where this is done just brilliantly, where, for example, if we have a group of boys who in general don't engage with kind of creativity, literacy type activities, aren't developing those fine motor skills and early pincer grip that they'll need for developing literacy later on. It's important they do that, but in a child-led setting, how do you make sure they're getting that opportunity? And this particular nursery I was talking to recently were saying, well, they've got this particular group of boys who are really into robots at the moment. And so they're making sure that those boys are doing a lot of drawing of robots at the moment and designing robots. And so it's about embedding the curriculum into the activities and the interests that the children already have. And as I say, I know that across Scotland there's an awful lot of nurseries and P1, P2 where that's done absolutely brilliantly. But I think it takes a real confidence in the curriculum and a real flexibility to be able to adapt activities on the spur of the moment so that all children are experiencing across the entire curriculum. And then I think later on, how do you make sure that young people are still given opportunities to engage with a real breadth of opportunities? A secondary school that I worked with was having really good success with STEM challenges. I think they tended to offer it to S2, but they recognized that when they offered it as an optional extra thing, that they tended to get the same equivalent group of boys year after year. And it was a brilliant experience for those young people, but it wasn't an opportunity that was being taken up, by a wider cohort. So they ended up running a kind of version of the challenge. They took everybody at S2 off a timetable for the day and ran it across a whole day, and then having allowed everybody to experience what it felt like to get to grips with that particular STEM challenge, then said, is there anybody who'd be interested in developing this a bit further and competing externally? And discovered that they got a much wider mix of who was interested at that point. So I think there's something about making sure that we're giving young people a chance to develop, really develop across the whole breadth of skills, but also as children get older, making sure that we're planning ways to get children to try things they think they might not be interested in, or things that hasn't occurred to them they might be interested in. I know I had another point there. And I think the other bit I think in there is about when older children are choosing things that are non-traditional, that we're thinking carefully about how we support them and build the kinds of resilience that they will probably need if they're going to go into post-school courses where they're in a minority. So whether that's girls into construction courses or boys into primary teaching or early learning, how do we make sure they have the resilience to meet the challenges that do come with being in a minority? And so that's kind of a really quick overview of the kinds of ways that we've tried to implement the findings from Sarah's research, or the research that's out there. How does that fit into a busy school? Because everything I've talked about takes time, takes a sustained effort over a long period of time, takes ideally everybody within the environment, within the setting, to be a part of it. And schools are busy, so how do we fit it in? So one of the key findings from the pilot was that schools found that really almost whatever their priority was for that school year, that our approach was flexible enough that it could kind of fit in with whatever they were doing. So I guess there are gendered issues, whether you're thinking about developing young workforce, or you're thinking about STEM or literacy or numeracy or health or well-being, then there are gender issues within there. And I think all the schools that work with this found that once they started engaging with it, they began to see lots of other opportunities, lots of other places where what we were doing could weave into the curriculum. So by and large, it didn't, once they got over the hurdle of understanding what it was we were about and how it might fit in with their particular context, most of the schools and early learning childcare settings that we work with find that it evolved quite naturally. And I suppose the other thing is to recognise that it can seem absolutely overwhelming, but that it is about doing small things, small tweaks, and those small tweaks can have quite a big impact, and about having a long-term view that you're not going to fix all of this in one term or even in one school year, but maybe having a 3 to 5 year plan is manageable, and allows different strands of the work to come together. So I'm just going to finish with where we are now. So I said we established a 3-year pilot in the summer of 2015. So that finished about a year ago. And we've been really lucky to have, the Scottish Government has funded us. We will be a team of 6 working with in Education Scotland as part of Education Scotland. And the intention is that we will have a national rollout. 6 of us will be working regionally. There's 4 of us in post at the moment. We're about to advertise for 2 posts, so if you're listening and you're interested, please do apply. And I suppose we are working to see how we can take what we learned from the pilot to roll it out nationally. How can 6 of us support everybody nationally? And at the moment, we're very much still working with individual schools and clusters. So again, please get in touch if you'd like to work with us. And we are looking at putting in structures to kind of develop local networks to work together. The bit.ly there, the first bullet point there, is the National Improvement page, our page on the National Improvement Hub. So bit.ly/NIHIGB, and we have lots of resources and links to other research and lots of ideas on there. We're on Twitter, so again, if you are interested and would like to keep in touch with what we're doing, please follow us on Twitter. And if you'd like any more information, or if you'd like to find out how to get involved with us, work with us more closely, then that's my email address at the bottom. We're going to go to questions, but I think before we do that, I was going to ask a couple more questions, if that's okay. So let me see if I can remember how to do this. I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to launch it. Thank you. So those of you who are listening, if you wouldn't mind answering this question, thank you very much. And again, I'll let it run. I can see the percentage you're answering, so I will let it run for a little bit longer. Give a couple more seconds for anybody else who's still thinking about how to vote. Okay, I'm going to close that. Thank you very much. And I'm going to share it. And then I'm going to hide it. And then I'm going to ask one last question. And then, as I said, we'll go down to Evelyn and see if you've got any questions for either or both me or Sarah. I'll leave it a couple of seconds longer in case anybody else wants to vote. And then I'll close it. And again, I can share that. And then hide. So thank you very much for answering those. That'll be interesting for Sarah and I to look at later. And Evelyn, I think, are there any questions?
I don't actually have any questions in. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we finish up, or if you do have any questions, anyone, please feel free just to submit them now. You should have a little control panel where you can type in questions and send them to us. So we'll maybe just wait a minute or two just to see if anyone has anything else to add.
I think we'd both be happy if people wanted to send us questions by email as well, and we'd both be more than happy to kind of answer questions that way afterwards too. So
I thought that was very interesting anyway myself. So thank you both very much.
Okay.
I think the research it was interesting to see the word clouds about what children had said about what jobs they associate, what boys and girls associate. And I think it would be interesting to see. I saw your graphs over time, which was showing that it's remained quite steady over time, but whether there has been any cultural shift, delving into that further, I think that's quite an interesting to think about whether, if you read books from say 50 years ago, how much has it changed culturally in that space of time.
I don't know what your feeling is, Sarah. My feeling is I wonder if it's quite mixed. I think in terms of books, there's more awareness, but I wonder if, as members of society, if there's the same shift. Do you know what you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think within books, there's certainly been a shift, I think, but I think sometimes it is these sort of unconscious messages that we give to children that aren't, it's fine to change your resources and change your materials, they're very visible, and yet some of us still have ingrained within us these kind of deep unconscious biases as a result of the generation, I suppose, that we were brought up in, and it's about how we become more aware of these and make sure we don't kind of promote them in the next generation of children as well. So I think you said yourself that's the hard thing to do. But yeah, I think you're right. I think the word clouds were really interesting, not just looking at the types of possible careers for boys and girls, but like you said, the breadth of different opportunities as well that are available to boys and girls too. Because I think very often there's a focus first too. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think very often there is a focus more on the the different career paths, but not so much on the other ones. And my feeling is as well, I mean, there is a lot of focus at the moment on trying to encourage more girls into STEM type careers, and I think part of it is, as a society, I think we're beginning to value those types of careers a lot more. And my concern is that maybe we're not valuing these kind of early year practitioner roles and social workers and these more nurturing roles, which are also really important. And I also think as a society, we're starting to value the attributes that are more masculine, such as showing leadership skills, being competitive, whereas attributes such as being kind and caring and compassionate, they're maybe slightly undervalued, I think, as well. So, when you're talking about those books like The Smartest Giant in Town and other texts as well, where there's examples of, men being kind and caring, I think that's really important that we highlight how important these attributes are within our society. It's not just about going out and getting those, high flying jobs.
Yeah, completely agree.
We've actually had a couple of questions in now, so we can move to them. So Andrea is asking, what is your opinion on science museums and exhibitions regarding gender balance? Sorry, I'll just check. Yeah, that's the whole question.
Okay. Well, I take that one, Sarah.
Yep.
As part of the kind of wider reach of the pilot project, we did a little bit of work with some of the science centres and museums in Scotland, and have had really interesting conversations actually about what role they play. And everybody I've worked with has been really keen that they have a role in influencing how society sees, I suppose, if it's a science centre or a science museum, specifically science, and who does science. There's a bit of a dilemma, I think, isn't there? Because if part of their role is to show the history of science, we know that the stories that tend to be told about who has historically done science tend to be about white bearded Victorian men. And so how can you shift the perception of who does science whilst also staying true to the collection if it's that kind of a museum? So I think absolutely that informal learning has a role in shifting, I guess, our perceptions of stereotypes about who does what kind of job, who does, if it's a science centre, particularly science STEM type roles. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, that's great. And we have one from Linda, and she said it's very interesting word clouds, people involvement and suggested resources. I work in nurseries in Fife and we are working towards gender equality. We have a question from Sylvia, and she said, are new trainee teachers getting this training in Scotland regarding stereotypes and unconscious bias?
Well, I'll start with that one again. Not across the board, no, not at the moment. In little pockets, we're beginning to make connections and beginning to have conversations about how that might become part of the training, but it's very much on a piecemeal basis at the moment. I was really pleased that part of the, I'm going to get the words for this wrong, there's something has just been launched around what's important for the training the new expanded early learning childcare workforce, and something around gender stereotyping is very much embedded in that, which I think is good. And again, need to see how that plays out over the next few years. So no, not really at the moment, but it's something we're aware of and hope to build on. Quite a number of my team, it's not quite answering the question, but quite a number of my team have made links with the probation managers in their authorities, and I know that most of them are delivering programs for probationers. So it's that early career teachers, hopefully developing awareness for them.
That's all the questions we have now. So I think we'll finish up there. If there are any more questions, please feel free to email them either to Heather directly, or you can send them to their communications inbox, which is just communications@gtcs.org.uk. I'd just like to thank Sarah and Heather very much for the webinar this evening. It has been recorded, so we'll post it on the GTCS website along with the presentation slides. And I've also got a download of Sarah's literature review, which you might find interesting to read. And also we'll link to the page on the National Improvement Hub, where you can find lots more information and resources. So look up for that going up on the website. Hopefully we'll get it up next week. But thank you all very much for participating, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thanks again to Sarah and Heather.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.